The Vrethkai patrol fleet was sitting near the boundary when the Calvin Hart crossed it. There were 11 of them. They were wedge-shaped ships, dark and angular, built by a species that had been fighting wars for longer than humanity had been writing things down. They had broken 3 civilizations in the past 100 years. Not pushed them back, not contained them, but broken them completely. The Vrethkai were not a species that did things halfway. The fleet commander was an admiral named Sorath Ven. He was experienced. He was calm. He had handled border crossings before, and they had all ended the same way. A ship appeared, he told it to leave, it did not leave, and then it stopped being a problem. He had done this many times. He expected to do it again now. His sensor officer reported the human ship at 1,147 standard hours. Sorath Ven looked at the readings and raised one of his facial crests, which was the Vrethkai equivalent of a mild frown. The ship was smaller than he expected. It had a standard configuration. It was not running any weapon signatures that his arrays could detect. He sent the standard hail. Human vessel, you are in violation of Conclave Directive 7 Alpha. Reverse your heading or be destroyed. He had said this, or something very close to this, dozens of times. The response was usually silence, then a slow turn, then a retreat. Sometimes there was angry talking first. Sorath Ven did not mind angry talking. Angry talking never hurt anyone. What came back this time was not silence. A human voice answered. It was a woman's voice, and it was very calm. Not the kind of calm that came from not understanding the situation, the kind that came from understanding it completely and having already decided what to do about it. Admiral Sorath Ven, this is Captain Nora Vance of the Earth defense ship Calvin Hart. We acknowledge your message. We are not reversing course. I would encourage you and your crews to think carefully about your next action. Sorath Ven listened to this. He played it back once. Then he looked at the single human ship sitting on his screens, and he gave the order to open fire. All 11 Vrethkai warships fired at the same time. It was a standard saturation pattern, the kind that left no room to dodge, the kind that had never failed to end things quickly. What happened in the next 4 seconds was recorded by his own sensor systems, and Sorath Ven would spend a long time afterward looking at that recording and trying to understand it. The Calvin Hart's point defense grid activated. It was not like any point defense system Sorath Ven had ever seen. His people's systems worked on a targeting cycle, acquiring one object at a time and neutralizing it. This system acquired everything at once. The hundreds of rounds his fleet had fired were met in the space between the two forces and destroyed so fast that the whole event looked, on the recording, like a single explosion rather than hundreds of small ones. It lit up the dark like a star going off. It lasted less than 4 seconds, and then it was over, and the Calvin Hart was still there, unmarked, sitting exactly where it had been. Then, it fired back. Danny Cobb ran his weapons console the way he ran everything, quietly and without hurry. He had already decided his targets before the enemy fire had even reached them. He had a list in his head, organized by priority, and he worked through it with the same steady attention he gave to everything. The Calvin Hart's main rail system used heavy slugs, accelerated magnetically to a fraction of the speed of light. They did not flash. They just moved very fast. And when they arrived at the place they were aimed at, the thing that had been there before was no longer whole. The first volley hit 3 Vrethkai warships. It hit the engine sections and the weapon mounts and nothing else. All 3 ships went dark and drifted. Their hulls were intact, their crews were alive. Danny had been very specific about that. Nora had told him she wanted survivors. She had told him why. He agreed with her reasoning. 2 more Vrethkai ships broke formation and tried to come around the sides. The Calvin Hart's lateral systems were already tracking them. The targeting computer had flagged the movement before the ships had even finished their turn. Danny made 2 small adjustments and fired twice. Both ships lost their drives cleanly and stopped moving. Sorath then ordered a flanking maneuver with his remaining 6 ships. It was a good maneuver. It would have worked against almost anything he had ever faced. The Calvin Heart did not behave the way things he had faced behaved. Instead of holding position or retreating, it accelerated directly at the center of his formation, which was the one direction the flanking maneuver left open, and by the time his remaining ships had repositioned, the range had closed to a distance where their formation was actually working against them. 3 more ships were hit. Sorath then ordered a full retreat. His flagship's engine section was sheared away 11 seconds after he gave that order. The flagship did not explode. Danny had been precise. The engine was gone, but the rest of the ship was fine, and Sorath then and his crew sat in a powerless, drifting hull and watched 4 of their surviving ships limp away into the dark. 11 ships had come to the boundary that morning. 4 of them made it back to Vrethkai space. The other 7 sat drifting, disabled, their crews untouched. Nora stood on the bridge of the Calvin Heart and looked at the sensor picture. Priya was already recalculating their heading. Kevin Marsh was monitoring the frequencies, which had gone very loud very quickly as the Vrethkai survivors started broadcasting. "Medical frequencies," Nora said. Kevin looked up. "Captain, broadcast medical assistance frequencies to all disabled vessels. Let them know we can render aid if any of their crew are hurt." Kevin sent the broadcast. There was a long silence from the Vrethkai ships. Then one of them sent back a short acknowledgement. No one was seriously hurt. They did not need assistance, but they had heard the offer, and they would remember it. Nora looked out at the stars. The battle, if it could be called that, had lasted less than 8 minutes. She had not lost a single crew member. She had not destroyed a single enemy ship. She had simply removed the problem in the most efficient way she could think of, and then offered help to the people she had just stopped. She knew the footage would travel. The Vrethkai would report what had happened. The Conclave would see the numbers. 11 ships, 4 returned, 0 human casualties, and a medical broadcast at the end of it. She wanted them to think about that last part especially. She wanted them to understand that it had not been an accident or a gesture. It had been a choice, a deliberate one. The galaxy needed to understand something about humanity that it had clearly not taken the time to learn. Humanity had been fighting things, including itself, for a very long time. And somewhere along the way, it had learned a lesson that most species never got around to learning. Winning was not the hard part. The hard part was deciding what you were willing to do to win and what you were not. Nora Vance had already decided. She turned to Priya. "Continue on course," she said. The Calvin Heart moved deeper into the space it had been told it could not enter. And behind it, 7 drifting ships sat in the dark, their crews alive, their commanders already composing the messages that would shake the Conclave to its foundation. The footage reached the Conclave chambers in under 6 hours. It was not a clean recording. It had been stitched together from several sources, including Sorath Ven's own sensor logs, 2 small journalist drones that had been following the Calvin Heart on a tip that turned out to be very good, and the passive arrays of a Sulan merchant vessel that had the bad luck to be passing through the area at the wrong time. The 6 ambassadors of the Galactic Conclave watched it in complete silence in the main chamber on the Conclave station. The chamber was large and designed to feel important, with high ceilings and curved walls, and the flags of 6 species displayed along one side. What mattered was the screen at the front of the room, which was showing 1 human ship sitting very still, while 11 Vrethkai warships fired everything they had at it, and then showing what happened next. The Doran ambassador watched the whole thing without moving. His name was Grath, and his species had once destroyed an inhabited moon as a demonstration of military capability during a trade negotiation. Not because they needed to, just to make a point. They had a long history of making points that way. He watched the Calvin Hart neutralize the incoming fire in under 4 seconds, and then begin taking apart the Vrethkai fleet, one ship at a time, carefully, methodically, like someone doing routine maintenance rather than fighting a battle. Then, he watched the human captain broadcast medical frequencies to the disabled enemy ships when it was over. He watched that part twice. "What is that ship?" he asked. No one answered him. The Sulan ambassador, a thin and precise being named Velor, pulled up the technical breakdown that his analysts had put together in the 4 hours since the footage arrived. It was not a reassuring document. The point defense performance alone was outside the range of anything the Conclave had on record. The rail system velocities were higher than their models said was practical, and the targeting response time, according to the numbers, was roughly 40 times faster than the best system currently in service among Conclave members. Velor read the numbers 3 times. Then he set the document down and stared at the screen. The Menthazi ambassador, who went by the short title Keth, leaned forward and said what everyone in the room was already thinking. One ship did this. It was not a question. It was the kind of statement a person makes when they are trying to make something feel real by saying it out loud. One ship, the Krell ambassador confirmed. The Krell ambassador's formal title was Honored Blade of the Second House, and he was one of the oldest members of the Conclave, with a long career in military command before his appointment to the diplomatic post. He had a very good sense for what he was looking at when he looked at a battle record. What he was looking at right now, he did not entirely have words for, which was a new experience for him. The Uvari ambassador said nothing. He made a small note on his private pad and did not share it with anyone. What followed in the next 18 hours was not a plan. It was a panic that had been dressed up in the language of strategy. The 6 species of the Conclave began talking about response options, fleet deployments, and coordinated enforcement actions. The words sounded organized. The thinking behind them was not. The Vrethkai wanted revenge. Their pride had been badly damaged, and they moved fast, contributing 40 additional warships to what was being called an enforcement formation. The Sulan contributed 40 as well. The Menthasi, who had the second largest fleet and the longest memory of any species at the table, sent 60. The Krell, whose fleet was the biggest in known space, dispatched 112 vessels. The Uvari sent nothing. They quietly recalled all their ships to home space, and, through a back channel that nobody in the Conclave was supposed to know about, sent a brief diplomatic message to Earth's Foreign Affairs Office. The message was polite and carefully worded, and did not commit to anything specific. Earth's office received it, noted it, and filed it without a public response. 217 ships were now on an intercept heading toward one human vessel. Back on Earth, in the operations center at Fleet Command, Admiral Louise Carver was watching the contacts appear on the long-range sensor display one by one. Junior officers called out numbers at regular intervals. The room was quiet, but not still. People moved between stations with purpose, passing data and updates back and forth in low voices. Lieutenant Evan Cole was 26 years old and had been out of the academy for 3 months. He was good at his job, careful and precise, and he had not yet developed the habit some older officers had of keeping his face neutral when the numbers were bad. He raised his hand from his console. "Admiral, combined contact count is 217 vessels, all on intercept heading for the Calvin Hart. Estimated time to engagement range is 11 hours. Louise had a cup of coffee in her hand. It had gone cold some time ago. She took a sip of it anyway and looked at the display. "Good," she said. "Nora's going to need something to do." Evan looked at her. He was not sure if he had heard that correctly. Dale Harmon was standing near the back of the room. He had not left since early that morning. He looked at the 217 contacts on the screen, and then he looked at Louise, and he understood what she meant, even if Evan did not. He had read the same files she had read. He had sat in the same simulations. He knew what the Calvin Heart was built to do. The galaxy was responding the way every powerful thing responded when it was surprised and frightened. It was gathering numbers. It was piling on. It was doing the thing that had always worked before, which was sending more ships until the problem went away. It had not stopped to ask whether more ships would actually solve this particular problem. Louise set her cold coffee down. She thought about Nora Vance out there, moving toward 217 ships with 214 people. She was not worried about Nora. She was something closer to sad, and the sadness was not about the battle ahead. It was about the 40 years that had made the battle necessary. She picked up her comm and sent a single short message to the Calvin Heart. It said, "We see the contacts. You have full authority. Trust your crew." 11 hours away, in the quiet of the Calvin Heart's command bridge, Nora read the message. She looked at the sensor display, which was showing her the same contacts Earth was seeing. 217 small lights moving through the dark toward her. She thought about the 14 colonies. She thought about the families in them. She thought about a document that had arrived on a Tuesday morning and tried to close a door on everything humanity had been reaching toward. She turned to her crew. "All department heads, full readiness check," she said. "We have 11 hours. Use them." The Calvin Heart moved forward, alone, into the space between two very different futures. The Sulan fleet arrived first. 40 ships dropped out of transit speed and formed a wide arc across the approach lane, positioning themselves in a pattern that was textbook for dealing with a single vessel. The idea was simple. Spread wide enough that no matter where the target moved, something was always in front of it. It had worked reliably for 160 years of Sulan military operations. It worked because most ships, when they saw that kind of formation, understood what it meant and tried to run. Priya Okafor looked at the formation on her navigation display and said, quietly to herself, "They want us to run." Nora was standing behind her. "Are we going to run?" "No," Priya said, already plotting the new heading. "We're going straight through." Nora nodded. "Do it." The Calvin Heart accelerated. The Sulan commanders watched it on their screens, and the first reaction was confusion. The ship was not turning. It was not slowing. It was not doing anything a ship being faced with 40 warships should reasonably do. It was coming directly toward them. The 40 Sulan ships opened fire. What happened next happened fast. The Calvin Hardy shield array rotated in a way Sulan engineers would later spend weeks trying to understand. Incoming energy did not simply get absorbed. It was redirected across the surface of the array and released through vents that happened to be pointed at the nearest Sulan cruisers. 3 ships on the inner edge of the formation took hits from their own redirected fire and lost their forward sensor packages. Danny Cobb was already working. He was running his weapons console with both hands and his full attention, which was not something he gave to many things. He had a priority list. He followed it. Ships that were actively firing were addressed first. Ships that had stopped firing were skipped. Ships that were broadcasting anything on the communication frequencies were flagged and left alone. He disabled 9 Sulan ships in 4 minutes. Drives and weapons only. Every hull was intact. Every crew was alive. The Menthasi fleet arrived during those 4 minutes, 60 ships coming in from a different angle. This was coordinated, or had been meant to be. The idea was that the Calvin Heart would be dealing with the Sulan when the Menthasi appeared, and the split attention would create an opening. What the plan had not accounted for was the drone deployment. The Calvin Heart's second major system activated. 48 autonomous hunter drones launched from the ship's lower bays and spread into a formation of their own. Each drone was roughly the size of a short-range shuttle. Each one was connected to the others through a shared network that had been designed and tested in simulation for 4 years, and had never been used in a real engagement until now. The network made decisions faster than any individual pilot could. It adapted. It redistributed tasks. When one drone was targeted, the others compensated without any instruction from the ship. The Menthasi fleet ran into the drone swarm and spent the first 6 minutes of their arrival simply trying to understand what they were dealing with. By the time they had figured out that the drones were not crewed, 14 Menthasi ships had lost their weapon systems. Nora watched the displays. She watched Danny's hands moving across his console. She watched Priya threading the ship through the formations with small, precise corrections that looked simple and were not. She watched the drone network indicators and saw that the system was performing above every estimate. Then she did something that none of the Conclave commanders expected. She opened a broadcast on every frequency the Conclave used. All of them at once. Her voice went out to 217 ships simultaneously. She told them exactly what the Calvin Heart had. She listed the systems. She described what they were capable of. She used plain language. She did not exaggerate. She did not threaten. She just explained, factually and clearly, what the ship could do, and what it would continue to do if the engagement continued. And then she made an offer. She said that any vessel that stopped firing and withdrew would not be pursued. She said that any crew broadcasting a distress signal would receive assistance. She said that humanity had not come here to destroy anyone. She said that all it had come here to do was move freely through space it had a right to use. She said all of this in a calm voice that did not rise and did not waver. 23 ships stopped firing almost immediately. Some of them turned and left without another signal. Their commanders would face questions later, and most of them would answer those questions with some version of, "We did the math." The rest attacked harder. The Krell fleet came in last, 112 ships, the largest military force currently assembled in the engagement zone. They arrived in a tight formation that turned loose when they ran directly into the debris field created by the previous 30 minutes of combat. Disabled ships were drifting through the lane. Drone fragments were scattered across a wide area. The Krell formation had to break and reorient, and the first 4 minutes of their arrival was spent doing that, rather than fighting. Danny used those 4 minutes. By the time the Krell were ready to engage, the Sulon and Menthazi forces had been reduced to a fraction of their original capability. 61 ships across both fleets were drifting with no drives and no weapons. The Krell commander opened a direct channel to the Calvin Heart. He did not shout. He was not angry. He was something that read more like a person who had been given new information and was trying to process it properly. "What are you?" he asked. Nora did not hesitate. "We're human, and we've been patient long enough." The Krell commander was quiet for a moment. Then he gave the order for a full stop. His fleet ceased fire. They did not retreat. They just stopped. All 112 ships sat still in the debris field and did nothing. Danny kept his hands near his console, but did not fire. He watched the Krell ships on the display, and he waited. The engagement had lasted 41 minutes. 1 human ship against 217. The Calvin Heart had not taken a single casualty. It had not destroyed a single enemy vessel. Disabled ships and drifting crews were scattered across the lane. But every person on every one of those ships was alive. Kevin Marsh, at the communications console, was tracking the frequency traffic that was now going in every direction. Conclave channels, private military channels, civilian signals, journalist drones that had been hovering at the edge of range were now transmitting everything they had. The footage was already moving. He turned to Nora. "It's going out," he said. "Everything. Everybody is going to see this." Nora stood at the front of the bridge and looked at the display. 217 ships had come for one. One had answered all of them, and none of them were dead. She thought about what that looked like from the outside. She thought about the Conclave ambassadors watching this footage in their chamber, the way they had watched the first engagement, but this time, with very different numbers on the screen. She hoped they understood what the numbers meant. Not the casualty numbers, which were all 0. Not the disabled ship numbers, which were very high. She hoped they understood the number that mattered most, which was the number of times humanity had been told to stay in its corner, and had done so, quietly, while its corridors were closed, and its colonies were denied, and its people were taxed and blocked and pushed back. That number was a very large one. It had been getting larger for 40 years, and it had finally, on a Tuesday morning, run out of room to grow. "Continue broadcast," Nora said. "All frequencies. Keep the medical assistance offer open." Kevin turned back to his console. Priya kept the ship steady. Danny kept watching his board. The Krell ships sat still in the dark, and the debris of their partners' failed assaults surrounded them. And somewhere at the edge of sensor range, the last retreating ships were carrying their reports home. The invitation came 3 weeks later. It was not long, and it was not warm, but it existed, which was more than had ever existed before. It said that the Galactic Conclave would convene a special session, and that a human delegation was welcome to attend. It used the word welcome. Someone had argued about that word for a while before it stayed in. Admiral Louise Carver made the trip herself. She took Dale Harmon with her and a diplomatic team of 8 people. She wore the standard directorate dress uniform, which was dark navy with no decoration except rank pins. The 8 people with her wore the same. No weapons, no ceremony. Just people showing up to a meeting they had been trying to get into for 40 years. The conclave station was large and built to make visitors feel small. High ceilings, long corridors, everything made from materials that did not come from any single planet. Louise walked through it and looked at it the same way she looked at everything, which was carefully and without showing much. Dale walked beside her and said quietly, "This is the first time a human delegation has entered this building." "Yes," Louise said. "How do you feel about that?" She thought about it. "Like we should have been here 30 years ago," she said. The chamber was arranged in a circle, with seats for each species and a central space for whoever was speaking. The 6 ambassadors were already there when the human delegation arrived. Some of them looked the way beings look when they are trying to seem calm and are not quite managing it. Some of them had the flattened posture of species that show submission through body language. The Krell ambassador, honored blade of the second house, sat with very straight posture and watched the humans come in with an expression that was harder to read. The Vrethkai ambassador opened with an apology. It was a long apology. It lasted 11 minutes. It had clearly been written by someone who did not have a lot of practice apologizing, which made it uneven in places, with some parts very formal, and some parts that sounded almost like explanations rather than apologies. Louise listened to all of it without interrupting. She kept her face still. When it was done, she inclined her head slightly, which she had decided beforehand was the appropriate response. The Doran ambassador, whose name was Grath, said fewer words, but they were more direct. He said that the conclave had made a serious error in judgment regarding humanity. He said the error had been based on incomplete information and a set of assumptions that had turned out to be wrong. He said he was prepared to support any measures necessary to correct it. Velor of the Sulan spoke next. He said that the transit restrictions on human ships had been, in hindsight, a mistake driven more by economic competition than by any genuine concern about stability. He said this plainly, without trying to soften it much, which Louise respected. The Menthazi ambassador, Keth, brought a formal proposal. Open transit lanes for all human vessels throughout conclave space. Full removal of the Kepler boundary restriction. A seat on the Conclave Security Council. Equal trade terms retroactive to the last agreement cycle. Louise listened to each proposal. Beside her, Dale was making notes on a small pad. The 8 diplomats were recording and cross-referencing. Nobody from the human side spoke until the proposals were all on the table. Then Louise spoke. She thanked each ambassador in turn, briefly and specifically. She noted which parts of each proposal were acceptable and which parts would require further discussion. She was precise. She was fair. She did not demand anything extra, and she did not minimize what was being offered. During a recess, Honored Blade of the Second House crossed the room and approached Dale Harmon. He was a large being, broad and armored in the natural plating that his species grew through adulthood. He stood close, which was how Krell showed that they considered a conversation serious. "I have been studying your species since the engagement," he said. "Your recorded history is difficult to read." Dale nodded. "It is. You have fought each other for most of your existence. Your history is full of wars, many of them very destructive. I have read accounts of things your people have done to each other that I found genuinely hard to understand." "Yes," Dale said, "that's all true. And yet in 2 engagements, against forces vastly larger than your own, you disabled rather than destroyed. You offered medical assistance. You broadcast a chance to withdraw before each phase of the battle." The Krell ambassador paused. "That is not the behavior your history suggested I should expect." Dale was quiet for a moment. He thought about how to answer this honestly. "We've had a lot of practice being at war with ourselves," he said. "After a while, you learn things from it. One of the things you learn is that the damage you do in winning follows you. It costs you later, sometimes in ways you don't expect. So we've gotten very deliberate about what we're willing to do and what we're not." The Krell ambassador considered this. "You were willing to disable. You were not willing to destroy." "Not if we could avoid it," Dale said. "The goal was never to hurt anyone. The goal was to make sure the door stayed open. Dead people don't open doors." Honored Blade of the Second House stood very still for a moment. Then he said, "That is a more sophisticated position than I gave your species credit for." "Most species that underestimate us do," Dale said. "It was not said with pride. It was said the way you say something that is simply true." The recess ended. They returned to their seats. The measures passed by unanimous agreement before the end of the day. The Kepler boundary was dissolved. Human transit was fully restored. Humanity's seat on the Security Council would begin at the next regular session. The Krell ambassador voted with the human delegation on every item, and on the final measure, he voted first, before anyone else. On the trip back, Dale sat across from Louise in the small cabin of the transport and looked out at the stars for a while. "Do you think it holds?" he asked. She thought about Honored Blade, who had walked across a room to ask a genuine question and had listened to the answer. She thought about the Uvari ambassador, who had said almost nothing throughout the session but had voted for every measure without hesitation. "The Krell will hold it," she said, "and where the Krell go, others follow." Dale nodded. He seemed satisfied with that. He looked out the window again. Back at Lagrange Station 7, the Calvin Hart sat in a repair dock, having its hull plating checked for stress fractures. It was a quiet job, methodical, the kind that took patience. The repair crew moved across the exterior of the ship slowly and carefully, checking every plate. Inside, Nora Vance was at her desk, writing. She was drafting a request for their next mission assignment. The request was for a deep survey run into an unmapped region, several transit jumps beyond the old Kepler boundary, a stretch of space that no human ship had ever charted. She had been wanting to write this particular request for 2 years. She had been waiting until there was no reason she would not be allowed to go. Now there was no reason. Kevin Marsh knocked on her open door. "Captain, word just came in from Fleet Command about the conclave session. The boundary is down." Nora looked at him. He was grinning in the way young people grin when something they were told might never happen actually happens. "I heard," she said. So what do we do now? She turned back to her desk. She finished the sentence she had been writing. Then she looked up. Now, we go see what's out there, she said. Kevin nodded. Nora heard him telling the rest of the bridge crew down the corridor, his voice getting a little louder than was strictly professional, and she did not correct him for it. She turned back to the window above her desk. Beyond the station's structure, the stars were very clear and very still, the same as they always were, the same as they had been before any of this started. They did not know about boundaries or conclaves or 40 years of small retreats. They were just there, burning quietly, in every direction, waiting. She finished the request. She signed it and sent it. Then she went to find the rest of her crew, because there was work to do, and they had a long way to go. The notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, and it was not long. It was not polite either. It was 4 sentences in the cold, flat language that the Galactic Conclave used when it had already made up its mind and did not care what anyone else thought. Commander Dale Harmon read it twice at his desk. Then he read it a third time, slower, as if reading it again might change what it said. It did not. The notice said that humanity was no longer permitted to expand beyond the Kepler boundary. It said the decision was final. It said that any human ship caught crossing the boundary would be treated as a hostile act. And it said, at the very end, in the same flat tone as everything else, that the Conclave wished humanity well within its approved space. Dale set the paper down. He picked up his stylus and put the end of it in his mouth, which was something he did when he was trying not to say something he would regret. He chewed through the stylus in about 90 seconds. Outside his window, the lights of Earth's orbital stations blinked in the dark. There were 14 colonies beyond the Kepler boundary. Families lived there. Children had been born there. People had spent years building lives in places the Conclave had now decided did not belong to them. Dale forwarded the notice to Admiral Louise Carver with one line attached to it. The line said, "They just made their last mistake." Louise Carver read the message in the Operations Center at Fleet Command. She was a tall woman with short gray hair and the kind of face that did not show much, which was useful in her line of work. She had been in the Directorate for 30 years. She had seen a lot of bad mornings. This was one of the worst ones. She stood at the viewport for a long time, looking at nothing in particular. The 6 species of the Orion Arm had spent the last 40 years pushing humanity back, one small step at a time. First, they had blocked the outer trade routes. Then, they had added taxes to human cargo ships that made trading almost impossible. Then, they had started denying colony permits, and now this. A hard line. A permanent one. Louise had known this moment was coming. She had prepared for it. She turned away from the viewport and walked to her desk and began composing orders. She did not order a fleet. She ordered one ship. The EDS Calvin Hart had been sitting in a classified berth at Lagrange Station 7 for 2 years, waiting. It did not look like much from the outside. It was about the size of a city block, which was not small, but it was not the kind of ship that made other ships nervous just by looking at it. It had a standard hull. It had a standard configuration. The sensor readings it gave off were ordinary. Everything else about it was not ordinary at all. 6 years earlier, after the 3rd time the Conclave had quietly closed off a human expansion route, a group of engineers and scientists at the Directorate had sat down together in a room and asked themselves a very simple question. The question was, what would it take to make sure this never happened again? They had answered that question with the Calvin Hart. Captain Nora Vance received her orders at 3 in the morning. She was already awake, which was not unusual for her. She was a woman who slept in short stretches and spent the rest of her time reading or walking the corridors of whatever ship she happened to be on. She had red hair cut close to her head and a calm voice that she had trained herself to keep level no matter what was happening around her. She read the orders. Then she sat still for a moment. Then she got up, put on her uniform, and went to find her crew. The Calvin Hart had a crew of 214 people. Most of them were young. Some of them had never been in a real engagement. Nora had handpicked every single one of them over the past 18 months, and she knew each of them by name. She knew who among them had families on the 14 colonies beyond the boundary. She did not bring that up when she addressed them in the main bay at 4 in the morning. She did not need to. They all knew. She told them simply what the situation was. She told them where they were going. She told them what might happen when they got there. She told them that nobody had to stay if they did not want to, and that no one would think less of anyone who walked off the ship right now. Nobody walked off. Chief Weapons Officer Danny Cobb stood near the back of the bay, with his arms crossed. He was a quiet man from Kentucky, broad through the shoulders, with a habit of going very still when he was paying close attention. He had been with the Directorate for 19 years. He had never missed a shot in his career. He listened to everything Nora said, and then he went straight to his station to begin his pre-launch checks. Navigation Officer Priya Okafor ran through her calculations 3 times before she was satisfied, which was 1 more time than she usually needed. She had grown up in Atlanta, the daughter of 2 engineers, and she had been obsessed with orbital mechanics since she was 9 years old. She knew the route to the Kepler boundary by heart. She had been running simulations of it for months. Lieutenant Kevin Marsh, the youngest officer on the bridge at 23, sat at his communications console and checked the frequency arrays twice. He was nervous. He was not ashamed of being nervous. He figured being nervous meant he understood the situation correctly. The Calvin Hart launched at 5:42 in the morning, Earth Standard Time. It moved out of the Lagrange berth slowly, and then accelerated. And within an hour, it was clear of the inner system and moving fast. The stars outside the viewports did not change. They never looked different when something important was happening. They just stayed where they were and burned quietly, the same as always. Dale Harmon watched the departure from the operations center. He stood next to Admiral Carver, and neither of them said anything for a while. Then Dale said, "Do you think they'll actually try to stop her?" Louise thought about the notice she had received that morning. She thought about 40 years of small retreats. She thought about 14 colonies and the people in them. "Yes," she said, "and that's going to be a very educational experience for them." He reached into his pocket for a stylus, remembered he had chewed through his last one, and put his hand back in his pocket. Out past the orbit of Mars, the Calvin Hart was already gone, a single light moving against the dark, carrying 214 people and 6 years of human anger shaped very carefully into something precise and quiet and ready. The galaxy did not know what was coming. It would find out soon enough.